Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We've been going through the series on bending the road. We all have the different ones where you come around the corner and it's not exactly what you're ready for in the road. And it reminds me of the time not long after we were here. Grady could probably help me out, but we as a Sunday school class, or his class, went off to I believe it was in Wagner somewhere, where we went to try out that different soup and stuff that they had. And Fort Gibson, is that what it was? Okay. And they had pickle soup, I think, and sauerkraut soup and some weird stuff. Anyway, I didn't want to drive all the way back to Owasso, and I was in my truck. I thought, well, I'll just go home. Well, it was dark, and I'm challenged at night trying to find directions, but I'm on dead empty in my truck. And I'm on some road, there's no signs, I have no idea where I'm at. And boy, you were talking about praying, because that was before cell phones. You run out of gas and you have, who's going to find you out there in the middle of nowhere? And the Lord was kind enough to help me finally get to a place where I knew where I was and where I could get gas so I could get home. So anyway, learn your lesson. If you don't know, follow somebody, even if it's out of the way. But it's interesting because it makes me think about, with the Navigator, how many of us think we know how to run our own life? We need a Navigator. And some of you might remember the Jesus Revolution. You might have seen the film that was just out on the Jesus Revolution. And Girardi was one of the founding members, been writing music for 50 years, one of the founding members of Love Song. And the Love Song was basically hippies that came to know Christ that were part of that group in California. And one of their songs that they wrote right afterward was called Front Seat, Back Seat. Some of you might remember that Tim sang that song here. And basically in the song, they write that when they were trying to run their life as a non-believer, they were in the driver's seat, the front seat, and made a real mess, and Christ saved them. But then later in the song, they write, well, then as a Christian, they tried to run their life and still messed it all up. It said now they've learned to sit in the back seat and let let God drive the car. So I think that's important. How many of us are either not a believer and trying to run our life, or we're a believer and we try to run the life, and kind of like Carrie Underwood's song, Jesus Take the Wheel, when we mess it up bad enough and we're on ice about to go out of control, then we say take it over, and when he gets to the stop place, what do? Take it back. So let's think about that, the Navigator or the under-oarsman. The reason I say under-oarsman, that's what Paul said he was. He chose to be an under-oarsman. Now, what's an under-oarsman in that time? Any of you know what an under-oarsman is? Okay, so in the bottom of the ship, basically, there were slaves, and when there wasn't enough wind or doing whatever, they actually had the paddles that would stick out, and they would be in there oaring to get where the ship needs to be going. And so he said he voluntarily is an under-oarsman for God. So who's guiding the ship? Who's doing all of it? So I think it's important for us to say, okay, most of us want to be on top, and we want to have the wheel, and we want to tell everybody else what to do. So be thinking about that. And this is going to be coming out of Psalms 107. To get the background of Psalms 107, we're talking about a navigator, under-oarsman, or front seat, back seat. To get the background, look over in Jeremiah 25. Jeremiah 25. And this speaks quite a bit about what Don has been talking about a lot when he talks about he's been reading through, whether it be Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah and the different ones in the Old Testament, how he kept telling, the prophets kept telling Israel to straighten up, and they wouldn't do it. So in chapter 25, you'll notice starting in verse 8 or 7, Yet you have not listened to me, declares the Lord, in order that you might provoke me to anger with the work of your hands to your own harm. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I'll take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I'll send them to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, will bring them against this land, against this inhabitants, against these nations around about, and I'll utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the sound of millstones, and the light of the land. And this whole land shall be desolate and in horror. These nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So the background is they're going to be in captivity for 70 years. That's why Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 says that 70 years is about up. What's about to happen to my people? And that's when he has the prophecy of Daniel 9, 24 to 27. That gives you the background. So now turn over to the psalm that was then written. There's 3 psalms that were written, but we're just going to look at Psalms 107. Psalms 107 is interesting. We don't know who wrote it. It could have been Isaiah. Some suggest it was King Hezekiah, but it's hard to say who wrote it, or Jeremiah. But I want you to notice so you have the background. Notice what it's told to do in verse 1 down to verse 3, the first part. It says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting." Okay, and that's interesting. We had the word loving kindness. It's used, it's the word hesed. It's used 250 times in the Old Testament. 6 times in this passage. Now you think about it, in many chapters as you have in the Old Testament, and you have 6 of them in this passage. And each time it's going to be a different scenario. But notice why I think it's interesting. They went off on their own. And notice I think it's interesting, the reason we think it's written during this time is because of verse 2 and 3. "Let the redeemed Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from the hand of the adversary, gathered from the lands, from the east, from the west, from the north, and from the south." Remember, he was bringing them all back in under Zerubbabel, and he's bringing them back in under Nehemiah, and then also under Ezra. So you think about it, the reason they're in having this trouble is because of their mistakes, wouldn't listen. You notice it says he restores them because of his loving kindness. And I think it's important. Notice, if that had been you and I, how much would have stopped at 70 years? You know, they've had so many years to make it right and didn't do it. Year after year after year. It's interesting, too. I think it's interesting when you look at it. You know, the loving kindness, that loyal, steadfast, faithful love involving a relationship. And I notice also the response was to give thanks. Now, how many of us, if we had been led in captivity, you think of Daniel, and you think of somebody and his 3 friends and the rest, it was the sins of their parents, so they're led off into captivity. How many of us are going to be giving thanks for the Lord for anything? Were they spared? You know, they honored the Word of God. God gave them positions of influence. So think about it. When you look at that, what I was thinking about this, how has God shown his loving kindness recently to you? How has he shown it recently to you? You know, I think what happens is we think we deserve it. That's not what we have here. If we get what we truly deserve, what is it? And so I think what happens, we need to really recognize that. So notice that he's going to have I was thinking of, you know, your different ones, you're going to have some pictures if you have. You stop and you think of it as, you look at Rosemary, the painting here, and you have the one over here of the shepherd when you have the grandfather who's gone on to be with the Lord, and then his son and his grandson. But there's 3, you're going to have 4 paintings here. And he's going to give you 4 paintings, and each one is a different scenario, but every one of them is going to have God's loving kindness in it. So notice the first painting you're going to have is of a desert or a traveler. He's on the wrong way or he's lost his way. Have any of us got on the wrong road? Have any of us lost our way? Or in a desert place? So look at how he describes it. Notice the desperate situation. Remember, you think about it, when they are taken off into captivity or when they're coming back. You know, when you're coming back and you're told you can leave, and they do, I'm sure there was highways with signs on where to go. And people just love for you to travel through their land to get to where you're going. So notice in verse 4, they wandered in the wilderness in a desert region. They did not find a way to an inhabited city. They were hungry and thirsty. Their soul fainted within them. Why would you say that's a pretty desperate situation? You know, you don't have any food and you're out there and you have no water, you run out. How long are you going to make it in the type of heat that they have? So here they have this desperate situation. Notice what they do then. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. So notice, I think it's interesting. They recognize the situation. We're lost. We have nothing to eat. We have no water. They cry to Him. You ever wonder why sometimes God puts us on a desert road? Or allows us, because He gets us to turn to Him. Notice it said He delivered them out of their distresses. Now notice the second thing. He led them also by a straight way to go to an inhabited city. How did they know how to get there? God gave them directions. And God led them. Have any of you ever been where you're lost or doing anything else and God just all of a sudden told you what to do or where to turn or what to do, and all of a sudden you found the solution, whatever the difficulty was? So here you have this situation they're in. They're desperate. Water, no food, don't know where they're at, no one to turn to. They turn to God. He rescues them. And notice what they should be doing then. Verse 8. Let them give thanks to the Lord for His loving kindness. He delivered them, gave them directions because of His loving kindness for them. Not that they deserved it. Loving kindness. Their duty then was to, notice one, was to give thanks for His wonders to the sons of men. He has satisfied the thirsty soul, and the hungry soul He is filled with what is good. They're supposed to thank the Lord. So, when they're were they in a tough place? Desert road, nowhere to go, didn't know what to do. They turned to Him, and the Lord miraculously helped them out. So I think it's interesting. So the first one is just this desert road they're on. And they certainly were as a nation. And they certainly were when they left and when they were coming back. And so I think about it, how many of us, we're in a situation now here at church, we need a children's worker. We know who in the world we're going to get. We know where to go. No. So if we don't know where we're going to go, what do we need to do? We need to ask the Lord to show us the right individual that can help us. And I think the same thing that we need to do. Notice the second one. So you have this traveler. The second one, in verse 10 down to verse 16, is going to be, you're in prison for wrong choices when you lost your freedom. Any of you ever feel like you lost your freedom? As you get older, how many of you feel like you're losing your freedom? How many of you find it harder to get up and get down? Or it's not hard to get down, just hard to get up. Okay? Notice then the prison that they're in verse 10. There were those who dwelt in darkness in the shadow of death, prisoners in misery and chains. So notice it's basically chained up, whether it's physically or whether it's of their own doing, whatever. But notice they're chained; they can't get away. Notice the reason is because they rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. That's why they're in captivity. How many of us have gotten in trouble because of our own stupidity, our own mistakes? That could be financially, it could be all kinds of addictions, anything you name it. We can be in prison of our own making. And like I said, it's amazing when you look at the different ones that you have. So they're in prison, wrong choices, they lost their freedom. Notice then verse 12, the purpose. Why would God do this? Therefore He humbled their heart with labor. They stumbled and there was none to help. It gets you to a place where you can't what? There's nobody else you can turn to. There's no way they can get you out of the situation. You can't call anybody. You can't do anything. What are you going to do? Same thing happened with Israel. And Israel, notice what they did. At least they woke up. They're in a terrible situation. And notice what they do in verse 13. It's interesting. So they then pray. They then cried out to the Lord in their trouble. He saved them out of their distresses. That's part of why in the book of Jonah, why Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh, because he said, God, you are a loving God and you're going to spare them. So if we're in a prison either because of our own making or of other things, we need to then turn to the Lord, recognize where we've made the mistakes and turn to Him and ask for help. And the same thing happens on it. Notice then the proper response, what happens in 13, He lets them free. In verse 14, He brought them out of the darkness and the shadow of death and broke their bands apart. So He set them free. Real similar, if you think about it, when they were praying in the book of Acts for Peter to be released. Again, that's amazing. What happened there? That night they're praying, and what happens? Chains come loose, miraculously come loose, the door opens up, and all of them are sleeping, and Peter just walks right out. And he gets to where they're going, and they've been praying for him, and what do they think? It's got to be an angel, it can't be Peter, because he's still in prison. How many of us pray for things, and when it happens, we don't believe it really happened? But notice they prayed, and he's out of prison. They're out of prison. So what's the proper response? And notice why he let them out again. Notice, let them give thanks to the Lord for, and there it is again. Why did he let them out? His loving kindness. Not that they've, been punished long enough or whatever it might be. But one is they're supposed to give thanks for the wonders to the sons of men. Notice who you're supposed to tell. He has shattered gates of bronze and cut bars of iron asunder. Doesn't tell you how he does it, but he gets them out of it. So I think it's interesting, you look at it, how many of us have lost freedom and are a prisoner in debt? Glenn's done those different at times here on just, on budgeting and things like that. But how many times, or how many people do you know that are prisoners in debt? I mean, that they're in debt to such an extent that they, humanly speaking, will never get out. And they have to really turn to the Lord. Really, they have to make changes too. I think what happens is when God does set us free, we don't want to go back to it. For instance, if you have trouble with pornography, don't go down the magazine aisle, right? If you have trouble with gambling, don't go to the casino to eat lunch. You think that's obvious, but people say, oh, there's good food there. Well, if you go there, then what's going to happen? So whatever it is that we have difficulties with, then just avoid it. I had a friend who, before he came to know Christ, had real trouble with baseball, loved it. To this day, he can still give you the 1969 bets, and he can give you all the records of what they're batting everywhere, every player, and everything. Baseball was his. But to him, he had to leave baseball and forget it, because is baseball wrong? No. But for him, he was going to get swept back into it if he stayed. So think about it. If you have this one, then if you're in a desert and you're wandering and you're tired and weak and sick, you turn to the Lord and ask for His loving kindness. Not that you deserve it. And then praise when He does. The second one is then if you're in a prison, you've lost your freedom. Notice the third one that you have. Some of you can relate to this. You're sick, you're in ICU, you've lost your health. Anybody relate? What do? I think it's interesting. Now in this case, it tells you why they're sick. Now that's not always the case. It's not necessarily here. In verse 17, fool, because of their rebellious way and because their iniquity were afflicted. Their souls abhorred all kinds of food. They drew near to the gates of death. The reason they were in ICU or sick at the point of death was because of sin. Now 1 Corinthians 10 also tells you they were weak and sick, and some of them even died because of what they were doing in 1 Corinthians. It's not always the case. It wasn't with Job, and it wasn't, remember, when they said, who sinned, this man or his parents? It was neither one. But he also told the woman, go and sin what? No more. So we can be, because in this case they were. They were sick to the point of death, and to such an extent they didn't eat anymore. So that's getting pretty serious. When you get to where people quit eating, you're near death. It reminds me in the book of Jonah, when did Jonah turn to the Lord? Now think about it, we don't know what kind of fish it was, but we say a whale because it can breathe air. So if you're in a whale and you're going up and down in the Mediterranean Sea, why did it take him that long? You think about it. Notice it says he's at the gates of death. You certainly are. If you get swallowed by a fish in the Mediterranean Sea, the chances are survival. But how many of us would have enough faith to pray to God to save me and say, I will keep my vows and go to Nineveh? How is God going to get you out of the Mediterranean Sea to get you there? So you think about it, when you had it, so here you are, they're at the point of death. Notice in verse 19, they're about to die. They then run to the Lord. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble. He saved them out of their distresses. He sent His word and healed them and delivered them from their destructions. It's interesting. He saved them. He sent word and healed them, and He delivered them from their destructions, whatever their destructions are. And I think it's interesting. A lot of times we need to have the same thing. God has to deliver us from our own destructions. A lot of times people are very self-destructive. They get out and they go right back in it. Notice how God, they're in this ICU and God responds. Notice once again, why does He do it? Notice in 21. And what we're supposed to do, let them give thanks for the Lord for His, what is it? Loving kindness. Once again, not that He deserved it or anything else. So He saved them when they were in the desert, about to die, thirsty, hungry, and lost. He saved them when they were in prison, in chains, and He rescued them. Now when they're on their deathbed in ICU, He saves them. Notice what He tells them to do. They should give thanks. That's 1. 22. They should offer sacrifices of thanksgiving. That's the second one. And 3, they should tell of His works with joyful singing. How many of us tell of His works with joyful singing? You ever wonder when you come to church, are we coming to a funeral or are we coming for joyful singing? And notice that it says make a joyful noise. That's the best some of us can do. But I think how many of us are doing it? It's interesting. So here you have these pictures. You're in prison. You can't get out. You're in the bars. You're stuck. Just like the one I told you last week when he comes to know the Lord. And he gets out of McAllister. And he's rising from the ashes and named his company Phoenix. Because God saved him and running the business today. But he had to make changes in his life. What about the one who's on his sick bed, deathbed? God help. Or we have a fourth one now. It's interesting. Look at the fourth one. It's interesting. You're going to look about the sailor or the perfect storm. Some of you might have seen it. Or when you're in the perfect storm, it's when you've lost all hope. Ever been where you know people who just lost all hope? That's interesting. I always wanted to do this, and I did it. I won't do it again, but I did it. I wanted to do deep sea fishing one time. So Will and I and another, we went when we were down in Florida, went deep sea fishing. Well, if you turn me around twice, I'm sick. Okay. So you can take whatever medicine. It doesn't make any difference. You turn me around twice. Well, I was fine when I could sit outside and could see land or whatever. Well, then a storm comes up, and I mean it's pouring down rain. So you have to get inside. And they said we got to go out deeper to sea to try to get stuff. You talk about sick. Now I was one sick puppy, but I paid money to fish, so I don't know what brought the fish. You know what I'm saying? And I caught a few, but it was a one miserable rest of the day. It was miserable. But I paid the money, and I had, I can say I actually caught some. And we actually snowed, all of us, on all sides of the ship. Our lines all got caught at one time and had to cut every line because of a shark. We all snagged the shark under. I'm thinking, well, Don't go overboard now. So here you are, you're in this deal. Notice the place of the storm. It reminds me of John chapter 6, if you remember with the disciples. Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on the great waters, they have seen the works of the Lord and His wonders in the deep. Notice the place of the storm. It's not near land. How of us never get in much of a storm because we never get out to the sea? We're always staying close to land to keep it safe. But you're not going to catch anything of the fish you're looking for if you're on land or near it. Notice the producer of the storm. I think it's interesting. And He, notice it's capitalized, God, spoke and raised up a stormy wind which lifted up the waves of the sea. They rose up to heavens and they went down to the depths. Their souls melted away in their misery. They reeled and staggered like a drunken man. They are at their wits' end. See, your seasoned sailormen, what happened to them? They've tried everything and what? They're at their wits' end and there's no hope. Very similar if you think about Paul when he was on the ship. You remember what they do? They tried to throw cargo over. They did everything. Lost it. Got rid of everything trying to lighten the ship and realized there was no hope. So here you have, they're in the storm, they're outside, God produces it, and they're in a peril. It's obviously there's nothing else they can do. Where was Jesus, by the way, in the middle of the storm? In John 6.
Sleeping.
He's asleep. Did He not say they were going to get to the other side? He told them they were. And were they seasoned sailors? Fishing. And they fished on that sea all the time. They've been through all kinds of storms. Thus, I think it's interesting, 28 then, what do? It's kind of like you and I, we've tried everything, we are at our wits' end, there's nothing else we can do. 28, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and He brought them out of their distresses. He caused the storm to be still, so the waves of the sea were hushed. As soon as they turned to Him, what happened to the sea? Calm. What happened to Jonah when he told the sailors, throw me overboard, and what's going to happen? I mean, that's amazing you think about it. It shows Jonah knows why, but he also knows the God who can calm the sea. And notice they recognize and come to know of the true God because of it. But just throwing somebody overboard, if I jumped overboard in the middle of that storm, would it have stopped? No, only God can stop that storm. John 6, Jesus spoke to the storm and what happened? How many miracles occurred at that time, by the way, in John 6? I challenge you to look at it. He spoke and what happens? He calmed the storm. What's the second thing that happened?
They were at the shore.
They were at the shore. So they were in the middle, calms the storm, and next thing you know, they're at shore. It's amazing when we look at it. So again, if we're in the middle of this storm, what should we do? Notice He gives you then what He wants you to do in verse 30. Then they were glad because they were quiet. So He guided them to the desired haven. He not only calmed the storm, He did what? In the middle of the storm, do you think they might have got thrown off course? Did they have all the necessary stuff? It said God guided them there. When you think about when they were trying to get Paul, when he left in the book of Acts, take him to the island of Malta, but did the natives come to see a knowledge of God because of it? Remember when he got bit by the snake? Sometimes God can even get us off course, what we think is off course, but He's taken us to a destination that He wants us to be at to be a witness for Him. In this case, He gets them to the desired haven. So notice how they're supposed to respond. I think it's interesting how they should respond. 31, let them give thanks to the Lord for, what is it? With loving kindness. Again, once more. So they're lost, they've lost their way, and God had then lost all their hope. God then saves them. Notice the second thing, for the wonders to the sons of men. Notice the second thing, let them extol him also in the congregation of people. So if God's done this in your life, by the way, how did anybody know about John chapter 6? Who was in the boat? Jesus and the disciples. Then how do you know about it? They told people. So when God saves you in a storm, what do you need to do? So that when other people get in a storm, they can think of your God, and hopefully it becomes their God, and they can be saved. Notice the third thing. It says, praise him at the seat of the elders. Not only in the congregation, but leadership. Leadership needs to hear it. Do you think Washington needs to hear about it? Do you think we need to hear about it in Oklahoma City? Our leaders need to hear about our God. We've lost all hope. So think about it. How many of you are in a hopeless storm and there's no way to get out? There's nothing you can do. Pull up anchor, and wherever it takes you, it's going to take you. What are you going to do? You're going to turn to him? And how many of you have been in a recent storm that you need to share about it? There's one last picture that you're going to have. What about when you've lost your home? Remember this comes out of Jeremiah and so on when they're taken in captivity. Notice, see, in 33 down 34, basically their land is ruined. They come through and they just destroy it. And you can easily see how that could take place on that warfare that they used. And even now, you look back and you look at what's going on in Ukraine or anything else, that land's being really destroyed. The reason, notice you have it in, is going to be there as well. The reason that you have why he's doing it, but now he reverses. Remember, he's bringing them back 70 years later. He now changes it in 35 down to 38. He now restores the land and gives it to them. He gives it back to them. 39, for the sake of time, he reminds them why they went through it. You lost it. I'm giving it back to you. But don't forget why you lost it. How about you and I? How many times we mess up, we ask for God's help, he helps us, but we have to remember. Notice, I think it's interesting, notice the response then that you have in 42 and 43. It says that the upright see it and are glad, for all the unrighteous shut their mouths. Who is wise? Let him give heed to these things and consider the loving kindness of the Lord. He let him come back to the land. Why? Loving kindness. You've lost everything. Mistakes you've made. God's loving. You turn to him, loving kindness he can restore. He may not be the temple that they originally had, but he still can help them build the temple. So I think about these 5 pictures that you have. How many of us are learning from ourselves? Or how many of us are bound to repeat it? And we look at today, I think in our country, we are not learning well from history. So think about it. When the first one then, you had the first one you remember, the desert. If you lost your way, what do we need to do? Turn to the Lord. He'll help us. You think about the second one you had was the prison. And you've wrong choices. You lost your freedom. Acknowledge it and see how he helps you through it and make those changes. If you're lost your health, turn to him. If you're in the perfect storm, a lot of things can be in a perfect storm, and then when you've lost your home, each time God helped them because of what? They first acknowledged it, turned to him, and then out of his loving kindness, he helped them.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.